The Hamiltonian is a word borrowed from mathematics that means that, to give a full account of anything in experience, we have to include all of the elements that go into it, including the negatives, the latent elements, and even the oppositions that define it as a potential object of desire. Let's look at the Hamiltonian in terms of something very familiar, which is the marketing of a product that is more of a dream than an actuality, namely Krispy Kreme Doughnuts, well known all over most of the U.S., but especially in the South, as a semi-magical food able to bring on instant happiness. The name itself gives away the formula for happiness. It's the death drive, but only Lacanians will know that this is not a totally crazy thing to say, since it's a way of combining opposites in a way that leads to repetition, that is, continued and continual consumption. One Krispy Kreme donut will never be enough, or rather, the number one will be the secret for why every new Krispy Kreme will be just as good as the first one. In Lacanian terms, this is the unary trait, mysterious maybe to college professors, but well known to the advertising community, for whom it is nothing less than bread and butter. You don't want to sell a few donuts, you want to sell many, 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 and the key turns out to be the unary trait. What is the unary trait? Those of us not in marketing need to know. It's a number that is perpetually refreshed, perpetually new, specifically because it is repeated. The only way to do this, as marketing executives all seem to know, is to find the right balance between opposites, whether it's dark light beer versus light dark beer, modern traditional versus traditional modern, or salty sweet versus sweet and salty. Just go to your grocery store to check this out. Although it's hard to imagine how something can be both crispy and creamy at the same time, Krispy Kreme advertising executives have found the answer it has taken Lacanians 5 decades to decode. The placement of the one is critical, since it will be the basis, the foundation, for a series of layers added to the mental map of the product that will create product dimensionality, or what in the trade is called product depth. Fortunately, we can linearize depth thanks to Lacan's slide rule analogy developed in Seminar 14, The Logic of Fantasy, where he showed how sex had dimensionality or depth, i.e., fantasy within the imaginary, thanks to the sliding effects of the contronym, which in this case was man and woman. Lacan's breakthrough was the theoretical realization of how, in the relationship of numbers called the Fibonacci series, or golden ratio, how something outside of the one interval could be subtracted to produce a power of that something. The equivalence here of 1 minus a, what happens if you move the little a back into the space of the 1, which you can think of as the trait you want to convert to repetition, either lots of donuts or lots of sex, can be operationalized by converting the remainder into a power, a literal power, of the missing element. The sliding of the slide rule is the principle by which you double the powers of the missing part, from a to the 1 to a squared, then a cubed, then a to the 4th, and so on and so on. Each power marks off a space that slides over to subtract from the previous interval, and the key is that the space within the 1 will never be fully exhausted. That is, you can eat Krispy Kreme doughnuts forever. How can such a delicate thing as taste, appetite, and desire be put in terms of numbers? Well, there are numbers and there are numbers. Fibonacci realized that a class of numbers could be folded in on itself, starting with 2 ones, then adding the previous number to the present one to create the next. This series begins an iterative process that never ends, because it's a ratio, not a real number. If the series slides across itself, each fraction is progressively better an estimate of the value of this ratio, which cannot be written out no matter how many decimal places you are allowed. The role of the 1 is the critical secret to this marketing of donuts, or endless desire for more sex. We get the numbers of the Fibonacci series on the right, but we also see how these are really the number 1 entering into itself in a recursive series, always aiming towards something but never being able to exhaust it, never satisfying its total hunger. This is really how you build upon love, eh? In the recursive equation x equals 1 plus 1 over x, you can plug the question back into the answer, just as the Cretan liar plugs the claim that he's telling the truth back into his statement about all Cretans being liars. We see that the 1 gives us the same progressively better estimate of the golden ratio as sliding the two number series across each other. But the role of the 1 is critical. It is both the Cretan lie and the Cretan truth, because it is pure reciprocity that makes the unary trait perpetually fresh. It is the reason that the Virgin Mary was perpetually a virgin, also why we can't eat just one Krispy Kreme. It is Mircea Eliade's idea of the eternal return, the basis of all human ritual, so we should pay attention to the arithmetic of the simplest of numbers. It's complex. Why is the 1 critical? We should ask instead, how did the number 1 and the unary trait get connected? What is the meaning of this connection? We have to understand what the marketing people understand so well, which is that the next time has to be as good as the first time. In this, they are perfect Freudians. But better than Freud, they know how to operationalize the role of the unconscious in activating desire, which is the structure or master plan for how we make demands of others and the material world. Lacan structured this in terms of the two kinds of others, the structural big other, the big A, or autre, and the active other, the little a, or auge petit a. Combined, they were the polar forces holding the 1 in tension. The big A and little a tried to pull it apart, but the 1 held them together. Otherwise, there would be no desire, no imagined loss, no plan for restoring that loss, no Krispy Kreme. The Fibonacci series suggests that the 1 itself is a cut, and that this is a special kind of cut that creates the thing it cuts into. The technical name for this is the catographic cut, which has quite an interesting history. For marketing purposes, however, the cut has to do with perceiving the donut as both an object and something for the subject, something personal. Without this bilateral division, no donuts would ever be sold, because they would sit on the shelves as impersonal objects, growing stale and unloved. What's key to note here, both about donuts and the unary trait, is that the 1 is a contronym that combines two forms of parallax, an ordinary or outer parallax we use to locate objects in space, and a secondary parallax that creates the space of desire that opens a pathway connecting our desire with the exact spot on the grocery store shelf where we can find true love. This secondary parallax is really primary, but we think of ordinary parallax as given, as natural, even though it is culturally constructed. This is why space can be used ideologically, by claiming that it's so natural that everyone should see the same. Secondary parallax is personal, but it can alienate us at the same time it is a dimension of satisfaction. Ordinary parallax and personal parallax live side by side and are usually good neighbors. But for marketing purposes, it's important to find ways to create overlaps and contrasts, where we see something as either a threat or a new opportunity. This overlap is structured like the stereogram, those flat patterns you look at by staring out into infinity until your brain adjusts to the subtle patterns that create a three-dimensional form illusion. This new space is a space within a space, and because of this, the structure of surprise is concentric. The relation that both divides and binds together the two parallaxes is anamorphic. In this Escher drawing, we see fish getting smaller and smaller, forming a circular horizon of infinitely small fish. But imagine that this is a view through a lens, and the fish on the other side of the lens are all the same size. This is like the relation of our Euclidean space, which we are trained to see as three-dimensional, to the topology of the projective plane, which doesn't have any edge, but is continuous and paradoxically finite, because, like a Klein bottle or crosscap, it folds in on itself, both inside and outside at any one point. The Euclidean edge becomes the center, which is anywhere and everywhere, because there are equal amounts of surface in every direction. Thus, the personal parallax can only enter into itself, concentrically, and is fundamentally a trap, because you can run, but you can't hide. This is exactly what the Krispy Kreme people are hoping will happen.